I thought my golden years would be spent exploring Scottish castles, not fighting my own daughters for my right to exist as an independent human being. At 64, I finally had everything I'd worked 42 years to achieve. A successful real estate empire sold, comfortable retirement accounts, and the freedom to take the month-long trip to Scotland that my late husband Patrick and I had dreamed about since our honeymoon. The first-class seat to Edinburgh felt like victory. After decades of putting everyone else's needs first, I was finally living for myself. Emma and Sarah, my 30-something daughters, had made their disapproval clear, calling my $30,000 Scotland adventure impulsive and financially irresponsible. But I'd earned every penny through 16-hour workdays in Boston's brutal real estate market, raising them alone after Patrick's heart attack at 52. I should have listened to my instincts when they started questioning my judgment. 30 minutes into my flight, my phone rang. My neighbor Margaret's panicked voice shattered my peaceful moment. "Catherine, you need to get back here immediately. Emma and Sarah are at your house with moving trucks. They have power of attorney documents and they're claiming you have dementia. They're selling everything, your antique furniture, your mother's china, even Patrick's tools. They've put your house on the market." Trapped at 35,000 feet, I watched my life's work disappear while my daughters told anyone who'd listen that my Scotland trip was evidence of cognitive decline. They'd manipulated a judge into granting them financial guardianship, froze my accounts, and were liquidating my Victorian townhouse in Beacon Hill for 20% below market value. But Emma and Sarah made one crucial error. They underestimated their mother. During the 7-hour flight back to Boston, I used airplane Wi-Fi to discover the full scope of their betrayal and plan my counterattack. 42 years building a real estate empire hadn't just taught me about property values. It had taught me about human nature, legal leverage, and strategic warfare. When I confronted them in my stripped bare living room, they genuinely believed they were protecting me from myself. "You've been acting differently," Emma explained. "More isolated, more defensive about money. We were scared of losing you. So you decided to control me instead of love me," I replied. They'd used my grandbabies as justification, telling 8-year-old Tyler that grandma was getting sick and needed help. They'd convinced themselves that stealing my autonomy was an act of love, that my desire for independence was actually evidence of mental decline. The confrontation that followed would determine whether our family could survive the ultimate betrayal, or whether the daughters I'd sacrificed everything for had destroyed the very foundation of trust that made us a family in the first place. I gave them 30 days to return every item they'd sold or replace it at their own expense. I threatened fraud charges for the fake psychiatric evaluation they'd used to obtain power of attorney. And I announced that I was rescheduling my Scotland trip, this time for 6 weeks instead of 4, because Catherine Hayes had never lost a war that mattered, and she wasn't about to start now. The mother they thought they knew died in that Edinburgh hotel room. The woman who came home to fight was someone they'd never met. Someone who'd finally learned that love without respect isn't love at all, and that dreams deferred aren't always dreams denied. Scotland was still waiting for me. Patrick's promises were still waiting for me. My own life was still waiting for me. And for the first time in 42 years, I was ready to claim it all. Regardless of who approved, regardless of who understood, and regardless of whether my own daughters ever learned to see me as something more than their safety net. The real question wasn't whether I could forgive them. The real question was whether they could earn back the right to call me mom. I smoothed my cashmere sweater as I settled into Seat 2A, first class on Delta Flight 142 to Edinburgh, and allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. At 64, I had finally reached the point where I could travel in comfort without guilt gnawing at my conscience. The leather seat embraced me like an old friend, and through the oval window, Boston Logan Airport stretched beneath overcast October skies that promised the kind of New England autumn Patrick and I used to love. "Can I get you something to drink before takeoff, Mrs. Hayes?" The flight attendant, a polished woman about Emma's age, smiled warmly as she offered me a menu printed on heavy cardstock. Her name tag read Jennifer, and something about her genuine smile reminded me of the daughter I thought I'd raised Emma to be. Confident, professional, kind. "A glass of champagne, please." The words felt foreign in my mouth. For 42 years, I'd been the practical Catherine Hayes, who drank coffee from a thermos during early morning property showings, and whose idea of luxury was ordering wine with dinner on special occasions. But Patrick had been gone for 12 years now. My real estate business was sold to an eager young couple from Newton, and my retirement accounts were healthier than I'd ever dreamed possible. If not now, when? The champagne arrived in a real glass flute, not plastic, and I raised it in a silent toast to Patrick's memory. "Here's to Scotland, my love," I whispered. "I'm finally taking that trip you always talked about." His grandmother's stories of the Highlands had filled our early marriage with dreams of visiting the stone cottages where she'd grown up. But life had other plans. Patrick's heart attack at 52 ended those dreams abruptly, leaving me to raise Emma and Sarah alone while building the real estate empire that would eventually fund this very trip. The bubbles tickled my nose as I sipped, and I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, Catherine Margaret Hayes, former scholarship kid from Southie who'd worked her way through BU night school while raising 2 babies, drinking Dom Perignon at 30,000 feet. If my mother could see me now, God rest her Irish soul, she'd probably lecture me about putting on airs and forgetting where I came from. But I hadn't forgotten. Every thread in this cashmere sweater represented a 16-hour workday showing properties in Back Bay brownstones to trust fund babies who complained about the original character of century-old plumbing. Every mile of this first-class ticket represented a weekend I'd spent staging houses instead of attending Tyler's soccer games or Madison's school plays. I'd earned this luxury through decades of sacrifice, and I was finally old enough to stop apologizing for claiming what was mine. As the plane taxied toward the runway, I pulled out my leather travel journal, a splurge from the boutique shop on Newberry Street, where a salesgirl younger than Sarah had assured me it was perfect for documenting life-changing adventures. The journal's weight felt substantial in my hands, its cream-colored pages unmarked and full of possibility. October 15th, 2025. First day of my Scottish adventure. I can hardly believe I'm actually doing this. Emma thinks I'm being impulsive. And Sarah keeps asking if I'm sure about spending this much money. But they don't understand what it's like to postpone your dreams for so long that you start to forget you ever had them. The engines roared to life beneath us, that familiar vibration that signals the beginning of transformation. I closed my eyes and let myself remember the conversation with Emma just last week in her cramped apartment in Cambridge. The building was one of those converted Victorians near Porter Square, carved up into affordable units for working families who couldn't afford Boston proper. Emma had been feeding Tyler, her 8-year-old son, mac and cheese from a box while juggling bills at her scarred kitchen table. The apartment smelled of vanilla candles, Emma's attempt to make the small space feel homey, and Tyler's artwork covered every inch of refrigerator space. "Mom, are you sure this Scotland trip is necessary right now?" Emma had asked, not looking up from Tyler's math homework. Her dental hygienist scrubs were wrinkled from a long day, and I could see the exhaustion in her shoulders. I mean, $30,000 is a lot of money to spend on. What? Sightseeing? $30,000. She'd said it like I was planning to burn cash in the backyard for entertainment. I'd tried to explain that it wasn't just sightseeing, that it was fulfilling a promise I'd made to Patrick before he died, that I'd worked for 42 years without taking a real vacation. But Emma just nodded absently and changed the subject to Tyler's upcoming parent-teacher conference, and how she couldn't afford to take time off work to attend. "Maybe I could help with that," I'd offered. The same reflexive response I'd been giving for years. "I could talk to your supervisor, or maybe we could arrange—" "No, Mom." Emma's voice had been sharp, defensive. "I can handle my own problems. I just think maybe you should be more careful with your money. You know, in case." "In case what? In case I got sick? In case the economy crashed? In case she needed another bailout she was too proud to ask for directly?" I'd bitten back the obvious questions and instead watched Tyler struggle with his multiplication tables, remembering when Emma had been his age and I'd helped her with the same problems at this same scarred table, back when it lived in our sunny kitchen on Beacon Hill, before Emma's divorce forced her into this cramped apartment where the radiators clanged all night and the neighbors' music leaked through thin walls. Sarah's reaction had been even more pointed. During Sunday dinner at my Beacon Hill townhouse, the Victorian masterpiece Patrick and I had restored board by board in the early 80s, she'd actually pulled out her phone to show me average retirement costs while we sat in my formal dining room. "Mom, according to this calculator, someone your age should be conserving assets, not spending them on luxury travel," Sarah had said, her voice carrying that professional tone she'd developed during her brief law career. She'd gestured around the room with her phone as if my 12-foot ceilings and original hardwood floors were evidence of my poor judgment. "What if you need long-term care? What if there's a market crash? What if Tyler needs surgery again? What if Madison's private school raises tuition?" I'd looked around my dining room with its original 1885 crown molding and the Persian rug Patrick had bought me for our 20th anniversary, and wondered when my daughters had become so focused on worst-case scenarios. When had they stopped seeing me as their mother and started seeing me as a financial resource to be conserved and managed? "Sarah," I'd said carefully, cutting my pot roast into precise pieces. I appreciate your concern, but I've managed money successfully for 4 decades. I think I can handle a vacation. That's not what I'm saying, Sarah had backpedaled, but her eyes remained fixed on the antique chandelier above our heads. I'd seen that same calculating look when she'd walked through the house after her divorce, mentally cataloging assets. I'm just saying that maybe you should think about the future, about what happens if what? If I died tomorrow? If I developed dementia? If the world ended and only hoarded cash could save us all? I'd wanted to ask Sarah when she'd become so pessimistic, when she'd started seeing life as a series of disasters to prepare for, rather than adventures to embrace. But Madison had been sitting right there, my 10-year-old granddaughter picking at her mashed potatoes, and I didn't want to create more tension in a family that already felt like it was held together with safety pins and good intentions. Instead, I'd changed the subject to Madison's upcoming school play, and Sarah had relaxed into the safer territory of her daughter's achievements. But I'd caught her looking around the room again later, her lawyer's eyes assessing, calculating, planning for contingencies I couldn't imagine. The plane lifted off smoothly, and Boston shrunk beneath us until the harbor looked like a child's bathtub toy. I opened my window shade wider and watched Massachusetts disappear into a patchwork of autumn colors. The brilliant reds of maple trees, the golden yellows of birches, the deep oranges of oak trees that reminded me of the jack-o'-lanterns Tyler and Madison used to carve on my front porch when they were smaller. This was really happening. After all these years of putting everyone else's needs first, I was finally putting myself on the priority list. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying, like learning to drive all over again after decades of being a passenger in my own life. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Sullivan, my neighbor of 23 years. Margaret lived in the brownstone next to mine, and our friendship had been forged in the trenches of widowhood and single motherhood. She'd buried her husband 2 years after I'd lost Patrick, and we'd supported each other through everything from teenage rebellion to menopause to the strange loneliness of empty nest syndrome. Have a wonderful trip, Catherine. Don't let those daughters of yours make you feel guilty for living your life. You've earned this 10 times over. Margaret understood because she'd watched it all unfold. She'd seen me work 7 days a week, showing properties in Beacon Hill, Back Bay, and Cambridge, building a reputation as the agent who could sell anything to anyone. She'd watched me miss neighborhood barbecues and book club meetings because I was staging houses or meeting clients. She'd also watched Emma and Sarah take my sacrifices for granted, accepting help with college tuition, car payments, and emergency expenses, as if it were their birthright rather than the result of my sleepless nights and skipped meals. Margaret had been there when Emma's marriage fell apart, and she'd needed a place to stay with Tyler. She'd watched me convert my home office into a temporary bedroom, giving up my quiet space so Emma could have time to find her footing. Margaret had also witnessed Sarah's law school graduation, where I'd sat alone in the audience because Patrick was already gone, and Sarah's then-husband couldn't take time off work. I texted back, "Thank you. I needed to hear that. The guilt is real, even when I know it shouldn't be. The guilt is learned behavior," Margaret replied almost immediately. "Unlearn it. You raised 2 smart women. Trust them to figure out their own lives." As we climbed through the clouds, I let myself imagine the next month. Edinburgh Castle at sunset, the Isle of Skye's dramatic coastline, maybe even finding the village where Patrick's grandmother was born. I'd booked a mix of guided tours and free days, wanting both structure and spontaneity. The travel agent, an enthusiastic young woman from the North End whose own grandmother had been Scottish, had mapped out an itinerary that balanced must-see tourist attractions with off-the-beaten-path experiences. "There's something magical about traveling to places your family came from," she'd told me while we'd pored over maps in her cramped office above a cannoli shop. "It's like you're completing a circle that was started generations ago. Would you care to see the dinner menu?" Jennifer, the flight attendant, appeared again, her smile genuine and warm. Behind her, I could see other passengers settling in for the long flight. Business travelers typing on laptops, families with children organizing entertainment systems, couples sharing headphones and snacks. Yes, please. I accepted the menu and marveled at options like pan-seared Scottish salmon with herb butter and grass-fed beef tenderloin with roasted vegetables. When was the last time someone had served me a meal I didn't have to plan, shop for, and cook myself? Probably not since Patrick and I had celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary at Loch Ober, back when the old restaurant still existed in downtown Boston. The passenger beside me, a distinguished man in his 70s reading a biography of Winston Churchill, glanced over with friendly eyes. He had the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of a life lived outdoors, with silver hair that looked naturally tousled rather than carefully styled. "First time to Scotland?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight rasp of age and what I suspected were decades of good cigars. "Yes, it's been a dream for many years," I replied, surprised by how easy it felt to talk to a stranger. At home, I was always Catherine Hayes, the real estate agent, or Emma and Sarah's mother, or Patrick's widow. Here, suspended between earth and sky, I was just Catherine, a woman on an adventure. "You'll love it," he said, his eyes lighting up with genuine enthusiasm. "I've been going annually for the past decade. There's something about the Highlands that gets into your soul. My wife and I," his expression softened, and he touched the gold wedding band he still wore. "Well, she passed 2 years ago, but we had some beautiful trips there together. She was Scottish on her mother's side, from a little village outside Inverness." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it. "My husband died 12 years ago. This trip was actually his idea originally. His grandmother used to tell stories about growing up in the Highlands." We shared a moment of understanding that transcended words. Here were two people who'd learned to navigate life after loss, who understood that grief doesn't disappear, but transforms into something you carry with you, like a worn photograph in your wallet, or a song that makes you smile and cry at the same time. "Then this trip is perfect," he said. "Scotland has a way of helping you feel connected to the people you've loved. Something about those ancient stones and endless skies. When Margaret, that was my wife, when she got sick, she made me promise I'd keep going back. She said the land holds memories better than people do, and she wanted me to keep adding to the story." His name was Robert, and he'd been a history professor at Harvard before retirement. As the hours passed, he told me about Scottish castles and clan histories, about the best distilleries and the most beautiful hiking trails. He showed me photos on his phone, landscapes so dramatic they looked like fantasy paintings, stone circles that predated written history, lochs that reflected sky and mountains like perfect mirrors. "The thing about Scotland," Robert said as he ordered his second whiskey, "is that it changes you. You go thinking you're just a tourist, but you come back feeling like you've touched something eternal." My students used to laugh when I'd get philosophical about it, but there's truth in those old stones. I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't in years. No phone calls from panicked clients, no emergency repairs on rental properties, no guilt about spending money on myself instead of helping Emma with Tyler's expenses or Sarah with her student loans. Just the gentle hum of jet engines carrying me toward a dream I'd postponed for far too long. The transformation was subtle, but real. With each mile we traveled away from Boston, I felt layers of responsibility and anxiety peeling away like old paint. I wasn't Emma's emergency contact or Sarah's financial advisor or Tyler and Madison's grandmother who always had cookies in the jar and solutions to every problem. I was just Catherine, and for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. I ordered the salmon for dinner and paired it with a glass of Chardonnay from a vineyard I'd never heard of, but that Jennifer recommended enthusiastically. The fish was perfectly flaked, the vegetables seasoned with herbs I couldn't identify but wanted to remember. This was how normal people lived, I realized. They took trips, they ordered meals they didn't have to prepare, they put their own needs somewhere near the top of their priority lists instead of dead last. Around hour 3 of the flight, I excused myself to use the lavatory and caught a glimpse of myself in the small mirror. The woman looking back at me looked different. Younger somehow, despite the silver threading through my brown hair and the lines around my eyes that marked 6 decades of living. There was something in my expression that I'd almost forgotten. Anticipation, excitement, the spark of someone embarking on an adventure rather than simply managing an endless series of obligations. When I returned to my seat, Robert was dozing, his book open on his lap. I pulled out my phone to check messages, grateful for the airplane Wi-Fi that kept me connected to home without the immediate pressure of having to respond to every crisis in real time. There were several texts from Emma, each one a small window into her evening routine. "Tyler did great on his spelling test today. Made your chicken and rice recipe for dinner. He asked for seconds. Hope your flight is going well." Something about that last message tugged at my heart. Despite her concerns about my spending, Emma was trying to be supportive. She'd always been the more emotionally available of my daughters, the one who remembered birthdays and called just to chat. Her worries about money came from a good place, from watching me work myself to exhaustion for so many years, from her own struggles as a single mother trying to make ends meet. Sarah had sent nothing, which wasn't unusual. She'd been distant since her divorce finalized last spring, dealing with her own financial pressures and what I suspected was a fair amount of depression. The law practice she'd tried to build never gained traction in Boston's competitive legal market, and she'd been working temp jobs while fighting her ex-husband over child support for Madison. Sarah had always been my serious child, the one who colored inside the lines and planned her Halloween costumes in August. Watching her life fall apart had been almost as painful as living through my own widowhood. I started to type responses to Emma's messages, then stopped. Part of this trip was learning to step back from the constant need to manage everyone else's emotions and crises. Emma was 38 years old with a good job as a dental hygienist at a respected practice in Cambridge. Sarah was 35, and despite her current struggles, had a law degree from Boston University and the intelligence to figure things out. They were adults who needed to stop depending on me for everything from emotional support to financial bailouts. Instead, I opened my travel journal again and continued writing. I keep thinking about what Patrick used to say about his grandmother's stories of Scotland. She'd describe morning mist over the lochs like God's breath on the water and stone cottages that had housed the same families for centuries. She came to Boston during the potato famine, married an Irish dock worker, and never went back. But she kept the stories alive, passed them down through Patrick's father to Patrick himself. I wonder if I'll feel some connection to her there, some link to the family history that Patrick never got to explore. Maybe that sounds foolish. I'm not even Scottish by blood, just by marriage. But I think love creates its own bloodlines. Patrick and I were married for 22 years. His stories became my stories. His dreams became my dreams. I also keep thinking about Emma and Sarah's reactions to this trip. When did they become so calculating about money? Emma used to be the dreamer, the one who wanted to be an artist before practical concerns took over. She painted beautiful watercolors in high school, won awards at the state level. I still have some of them framed in my bedroom. Sarah was going to change the world through law before she discovered that most legal work is about arguing over money rather than fighting for justice. Maybe watching me work so hard for so many years taught them the wrong lessons. Maybe they learned to see money as the most important thing, instead of seeing it as a tool for creating the life you want. I sacrificed so much to give them security, but perhaps in doing so, I taught them to be afraid instead of brave. I hope this trip teaches me, and eventually them, that there's more to living than just surviving, that dreams deferred aren't always dreams denied, that it's never too late to honor the promises you made to the people you loved. The cabin lights dimmed for the overnight portion of our journey, and I adjusted my seat to the lie-flat position. The luxury still felt surreal. Sheets and a real pillow, a comfort kit with moisturizer and lip balm, the kind of service I'd only seen in movies. As I pulled the provided blanket up to my chin, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in decades. Around me, other passengers were settling in for sleep. A young couple across the aisle was sharing a tablet, watching what looked like a romantic comedy with subtitles. Behind me, a businessman was still typing on his laptop, the blue glow of his screen casting shadows on his tired face. In the row ahead, a mother was reading to her daughter, their voices soft and rhythmic in the dimmed cabin. All these lives intersecting briefly at 35,000 feet, each person carrying their own stories, their own dreams, their own complicated relationships with the people they'd left on the ground. Tomorrow, I would wake up in Edinburgh, in a country I'd never visited, with a month of adventures ahead of me. For the first time since Patrick died, I was living for myself instead of through other people. It felt terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely right. I was finally keeping the promise I'd made to Patrick during his last days in Massachusetts General Hospital, when the machines were beeping around us and we both knew our time was running out. "Take the trip to Scotland someday," he'd whispered, his hand weak in mine. "See the places Grandma Margaret described. Take pictures for me. Don't let our dreams die just because I have to." I'd promised him I would, but life had gotten in the way. Emma's divorce, Sarah's struggles with law school, Tyler's birth, Madison's birth, the demands of building a business, the exhaustion of single motherhood. There had always been a reason to postpone, to put someone else's needs first, to be practical instead of adventurous. But as I drifted toward sleep at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic, listening to the steady rhythm of engines carrying me toward Scotland, I felt Patrick's presence as clearly as if he were sitting beside me. Not in any supernatural sense, but in the way that love transcends death, in the way that keeping promises to the dead honors the life you shared with them. The last thing I remembered before sleep took over was the gentle vibration of the plane carrying me toward Scotland, toward Patrick's dreams, toward the woman I was meant to be before life made me into someone else. I was finally free, finally brave, finally ready to discover what lay beyond the boundaries of duty and sacrifice I'd built around myself for 42 years. If I had known what was waiting for me back in Boston, if I had known that while I slept peacefully above the Atlantic, Emma and Sarah were making phone calls that would transform my dream vacation into the fight of my life, would I have gotten off the plane and never looked back? Would I have chosen the safety of my controlled, predictable life over the unknown territory of freedom and self-discovery? I don't think so. Some journeys are worth taking even when you can't see the destination, even when the people you love most try to stop you from taking the first step. And some promises are worth keeping even when they cost you everything you thought you knew about your own life. Scotland was calling, and for the first time in 42 years, I was finally ready to answer. But I was about to learn that the most important journey wasn't the one that would take me to Edinburgh. It was the one that would bring me home to fight for everything I'd built, everything I'd earned, and everything I thought I could trust about the daughters I'd raised to be better than this. The irony would hit me later. I was finally learning to put myself first, just in time to discover that the people I'd put first my entire life had decided I was no longer capable of making that choice for myself. I woke to the gentle turbulence of our descent into Edinburgh, my body stiff from sleeping in an airplane seat despite the first-class accommodations. Through the small window, Scotland spread beneath us like a watercolor painting, rolling green hills dotted with sheep, ancient stone walls dividing fields that had been farmed for centuries, and in the distance, the dramatic silhouette of Edinburgh Castle perched on its volcanic rock like something from a fairy tale. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final descent into Edinburgh Airport," the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Local time is 7:30 a.m. and it's a beautiful Scottish morning with partly cloudy skies and a temperature of 12 degrees Celsius, about 54 degrees Fahrenheit for our American passengers." Robert stirred beside me, blinking awake with the slightly disoriented look of someone adjusting to a new time zone. "Well, Catherine, welcome to Scotland," he said, peering out the window with the enthusiasm of someone returning to a beloved place. "Look at that light. You can't get that quality of morning light anywhere else in the world." I pressed my face to the window, drinking in my first glimpse of the country Patrick had dreamed of visiting. The landscape was everything he'd described and more. Impossibly green, ancient, mysterious, in the way that only old countries can be. Somewhere down there were the villages his grandmother had described, the stone cottages where generations of his family had lived and loved and died before crossing the Atlantic to start over in Boston's Irish neighborhoods. As we taxied to the gate, I felt a surge of pure joy that caught me off guard. When was the last time I'd felt this kind of uncomplicated happiness? Not the satisfaction of a successful real estate closing, or the relief of solving one of Emma or Sarah's crises, but actual joy, the kind that bubbles up from somewhere deep inside and makes you want to laugh out loud for no reason, except that you're alive, and in the world, and everything is possible. I gathered my carry-on bag and said goodbye to Robert, who was catching a connecting flight to Glasgow. "Enjoy every moment," he told me as we waited to disembark. "And don't let anyone back home make you feel guilty for taking this time. You've earned it." His words would prove more prophetic than either of us could have imagined. Edinburgh Airport was smaller and more manageable than Logan, with a distinctly European efficiency that I found immediately appealing. My luggage arrived quickly, and within an hour I was in a taxi driving through the Scottish countryside toward the city centre. The driver, a cheerful man named Malcolm with an accent so thick I had to concentrate to understand him, pointed out landmarks and offered recommendations for restaurants and pubs. "First time in Scotland?" he asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Yes, and I'm completely enchanted already," I replied honestly. "My late husband's grandmother was from somewhere near Inverness. I'm hoping to visit there later in my trip." "Ah, the Highlands," Malcolm said with obvious pride. "Now that's God's country, that is. You'll love it there. Got that wild beauty that gets into your bones and never lets go." We drove through Edinburgh's Old Town, past medieval buildings that made Boston's historic architecture look practically modern. The Royal Mile stretched before us like a living history book, with cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, and buildings that had stood since before America was even a colonial dream. My hotel, the Caledonian Edinburgh, was everything the travel agent had promised: elegant, historic, and positioned perfectly for exploring the city. As I checked in, the concierge, a polished woman about Sarah's age, handed me a welcome packet and asked about my plans. "I have a few guided tours booked," I said, "but I also want to leave time for spontaneous exploration. This is my first time in Scotland." "Brilliant," she said with genuine enthusiasm. "You've picked a perfect time to visit. The autumn colors are spectacular this year, and the weather's been unusually cooperative. Are you traveling alone? Yes, I replied, and for the first time in years, that didn't feel like something to be embarrassed about. It's a personal pilgrimage of sorts. My room was on the 4th floor with a view of Edinburgh Castle, and as I stood at the window looking out at the ancient fortress, I felt Patrick's presence so strongly it took my breath away. This was what we'd dreamed of sharing. This view, this moment, this sense of stepping outside our everyday lives into something larger and more meaningful. I unpacked quickly, hanging my clothes in the wardrobe and arranging my toiletries in the marble bathroom. The luxury still felt surreal. Thick towels, expensive soaps, a view that belonged on postcards. After decades of budget hotels during real estate conferences and family vacations measured in careful dollars, this felt like living someone else's life. But it was my life now. My choices, my money, my dreams finally taking precedence over everyone else's needs and opinions. I decided to start my Scottish adventure with a walk through the old town, maybe grab breakfast at one of the cafes Malcolm had recommended. As I gathered my purse and jacket, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Hope you landed safely. Tyler wants to video call later to see your hotel room." I smiled and typed back, "Landed perfectly. Scotland is even more beautiful than I imagined. Tell Tyler I'll call tonight. His time, not mine." It felt good to set that boundary, to make it clear that I wasn't going to reorganize my schedule around everyone else's convenience anymore. This trip was about me, and that was going to take some adjustment for all of us. I was just reaching for the door handle when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Margaret Sullivan, and I almost didn't answer. It was barely 8 a.m. in Boston, and Margaret wasn't typically an early riser. But something made me pick up. "Catherine?" Margaret's voice was tight with panic, and my stomach immediately dropped. "Catherine, thank God you answered. You need to get back here immediately." "What?" I sank into the chair by the window, my legs suddenly unsteady. "Margaret, what's wrong? Is someone hurt?" "Emma and Sarah are at your house," Margaret said, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to get them out. "They showed up an hour ago with moving trucks and some kind of legal papers. They're selling everything, Catherine, everything. The antique furniture, your mother's china, even Patrick's tools from the garage. They have men loading up trucks right now." The words hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant even to myself. They don't have the right to. They're saying they have power of attorney," Margaret continued, and I could hear the sound of trucks and shouting in the background. "They have some kind of document, and they're claiming you have early-stage dementia. They told the moving crew that your trip to Scotland was evidence of irrational spending and cognitive decline." The room seemed to tilt around me. "Dementia?" I whispered. "Margaret, I don't have dementia. I'm completely fine. This trip isn't irrational. It's something I've wanted to do for years. I know that, and you know that, but they're telling everyone who'll listen that you're not capable of managing your own affairs anymore. Catherine, they've convinced a judge to grant them temporary financial guardianship. They're liquidating everything." I stood up so quickly, the chair rolled backward and hit the wall. Through my hotel window, Edinburgh Castle looked exactly the same as it had moments before, but my entire world had shifted on its axis. "What about my bank accounts? My investments?" "Frozen," Margaret said grimly. I saw Sarah on her phone with what sounded like financial institutions. "And Catherine, they've put the house on the market. There's already a realtor's sign in your front yard." My house. The Victorian townhouse Patrick and I had bought as newlyweds, had restored with our own hands, had raised our daughters in, had filled with 42 years of memories. They were selling it at 20% below market value, according to the whispered conversation I'd overheard between two moving crew members. "But how?" I asked, pacing the length of my hotel room like a caged animal. "How is this even possible? You can't just declare someone incompetent without medical evidence, without due process." "They have medical documentation," Margaret said, her voice heavy with disgust. "I don't know how they got it, but Emma was waving around some kind of psychiatric evaluation when the neighbors started asking questions. She's telling everyone you've been showing signs of confusion and poor judgment for months." My mind raced through recent interactions with Emma and Sarah. The questions about my spending, the suggestions that I should be more careful with money, Sarah's insistence on reviewing my financial planning. I'd thought they were being overprotective. I'd had no idea they were building a case against me. "Margaret, I need you to call Judge Patricia Morrison," I said, trying to force my lawyer's training to override my emotional panic. Patricia and I had been in the same book club for 15 years. She'd know this was insane. Tell her what's happening. Tell her I'm completely competent and this is some kind of fraud. I already tried, Margaret said. Her office said she's recused herself because of your friendship. The case was assigned to Judge Henderson, someone Emma apparently knows through the dental practice where she works. Of course. Emma had spent years networking in Cambridge's medical community, building relationships with doctors and lawyers and judges. She'd used those connections to orchestrate this betrayal with surgical precision. What about my car? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Sold to CarMax this morning. They're claiming you're too unsafe to drive. I sank back into the chair, my legs no longer willing to support me. In the space of one phone call, I'd gone from a successful businesswoman on a well-deserved vacation to a woman whose own daughters had legally declared her incompetent and were systematically destroying the life she'd spent 4 decades building. Catherine, are you still there? I'm here, I said, though I felt like I was floating somewhere outside my body, watching this nightmare unfold from a great distance. Margaret, I need to get home. I need to stop this. How long will that take? I looked out at Edinburgh Castle, at the Scotland Patrick and I had dreamed of exploring together, at the month of freedom and self-discovery I'd finally claimed for myself. The earliest I can get a flight will probably be tomorrow morning. Maybe tonight if I'm lucky. Catherine, I'm so sorry, Margaret said, and I could hear tears in her voice. I can't believe they're doing this to you. I can't believe those girls would. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both knew what this was. The ultimate betrayal. Daughters who decided their own financial desperation justified destroying their mother's autonomy and dignity. Keep watching, I told Margaret. Document everything you can. Take pictures if possible. I'll be home as soon as I can arrange it. After I hung up, I sat in the elegant hotel chair looking out at the ancient castle and tried to process what had just happened. 12 hours ago, I'd been Catherine Hayes, successful businesswoman and proud mother, finally taking the trip of a lifetime. Now I was Catherine Hayes, woman declared mentally incompetent by her own children, watching her life's work be sold off piece by piece while she sat powerless in a foreign country. The irony was stunning. I was finally learning to put myself first, just in time to discover that the people I'd put first my entire life had decided I was no longer capable of making that choice for myself. I called the concierge immediately. I need to change my flight, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I have a family emergency and need to return to Boston as soon as possible. Of course, she said with professional sympathy. Let me see what we can arrange. While she worked on rebooking my flight, I called the airline directly, hoping to expedite the process. The customer service representative was helpful, but realistic. The earliest flight I could catch would leave Edinburgh at 6 p.m. that evening, arriving in Boston around 10 p.m. local time after a connection in London. 18 more hours before I could get home. 18 hours while Emma and Sarah continued their systematic destruction of everything I'd worked for. As I packed my suitcase with hands that shook with rage and grief, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Hope you're having a wonderful first day in Scotland. Can't wait to hear about your adventures. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. She was sitting in my living room directing the sale of my possessions while texting me cheerful messages about my vacation. The daughter I'd raised, the woman I'd sacrificed everything for, was actively destroying my life while pretending to care about my happiness. I called her directly. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and fake. Mom, how's Edinburgh? I saw the photos you posted on Instagram. The castle looks amazing. Emma, I said, my voice deadly calm, I know what you're doing. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Emma spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more defensive. Mom, I don't know what you mean. I mean the moving trucks. I mean the power of attorney documents. I mean selling my house while I'm 3,000 miles away. Another long pause. Then, Mom, we're just trying to help you. Sarah and I have been worried about you for months. This whole Scotland trip. It's not like you to be so impulsive with money. We think you need some support making financial decisions. I need support? I laughed, and the sound was bitter even to my own ears. Emma, I built a multi-million-dollar real estate business from nothing. I managed to raise 2 daughters alone after your father died. I think I can handle booking a vacation. But Mom, $30,000 for a month in Scotland? That's not responsible at someone your age. What if you need long-term care? What if there's an emergency? There it was, the same argument Sarah had made over Sunday dinner. The same concerns they'd both been raising for weeks. They'd been testing me, building their case, gathering evidence for this moment when they'd swoop in and take control of my life for my own good. Emma listened to me very carefully, I said, standing up and walking to the window. I am completely mentally competent. I do not have dementia. This trip is not evidence of poor judgment. It's evidence that I'm finally living the life I want, instead of the life everyone else expects me to live. Mom, you're being defensive, which is actually a sign of, don't you dare, I cut her off. Don't you dare try to psychoanalyze me. I'm your mother, not your patient, and I'm coming home to stop whatever this is. We're not doing anything wrong, Emma said, but her voice wavered. We have legal documentation. We're following proper procedures. We're protecting you from making decisions you might regret later. Protecting me? I felt my voice rising and forced it back down. Emma, you're stealing from me. You're selling my possessions without my consent. You're destroying my home while I'm out of the country. That's not protection. That's theft. It's not theft if we have legal authority, Emma said, and now her voice had gone cold, professional. And we do have that authority. The court agreed that you're showing signs of diminished capacity. Based on what evidence? What signs? The impulsive spending, the isolation from family and friends, the refusal to accept help or advice, the trip to Scotland despite our concerns about your financial security. Each accusation hit like a slap. Impulsive spending, taking a vacation I'd planned for 2 years with money I'd earned over 4 decades. Isolation, learning to have boundaries instead of being available for every crisis. Refusing help, declining to let them manage my life for me. The trip to Scotland, fulfilling a promise to my dead husband. They'd taken every sign of my growing independence and reframed it as evidence of mental decline. Emma, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay strong, how could you do this to me? After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed. Mom, this isn't about the past. This is about making sure you're safe and secure for the future. Sarah and I love you, and we're not going to stand by and watch you make decisions that could leave you vulnerable. Love. She was using the word love to justify stealing my life away from me. If you loved me, I said, you would trust me to make my own decisions. You would talk to me about your concerns instead of going behind my back to a judge. You would see me as your mother who deserves respect, not as a problem to be managed. We tried talking to you, Emma said. You wouldn't listen. You just kept insisting that you knew best. Because I do know best about my own life. The conversation was going in circles, and I could hear voices in the background, Sarah probably, and the moving crew Emma had hired to dismantle my existence. Time was running out with every minute I spent arguing. I'm flying home tonight, I said. And Emma, I want everything stopped immediately. No more sales, no more moving trucks, no more liquidating my assets. Mom, we can't do that. The legal process is already in motion. But don't worry. We're making sure everything is handled properly. We're not trying to hurt you. Not trying to hurt me. As if destroying everything I'd worked for was somehow a gentle, loving act. After I hung up, I sat in the Edinburgh hotel room that should have been the beginning of my Scottish adventure and felt something breaking inside my chest. Not just my heart, though that was certainly shattered. Something deeper. My faith in the people I'd loved most. My belief that sacrifice and devotion meant something. My fundamental trust in the family bonds I'd spent my adult life nurturing. Emma and Sarah hadn't just stolen my money and possessions. They'd stolen my identity as their mother, my role as the family matriarch, my right to be seen as a competent adult deserving of respect. They'd reduced me to a problem to be solved, a risk to be managed, a burden to be handled efficiently. The worst part was that they genuinely seemed to believe they were doing the right thing. In their minds, they were saving me from myself, protecting me from the consequences of poor judgment I was too diminished to recognize. They'd convinced themselves that my desire for independence was actually evidence of incapacity. I called Sarah next, steeling myself for another version of the same conversation. Mom? Sarah's voice was carefully modulated, professional. The tone she'd used during her brief law career when she was trying to sound authoritative. Emma said you called. I hope you understand that we're only trying to help. Help? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. Sarah, you're a lawyer. You know what due process means. You know that people have rights even when their children disagree with their choices. Former lawyer, Sarah corrected. And yes, I know about due process. That's why we followed proper legal procedures. We have documentation from a qualified psychiatrist confirming our concerns about your cognitive state. What psychiatrist? I haven't seen a psychiatrist. Dr. Rebecca Chen at Cambridge Mental Health Associates. She reviewed your recent behavior patterns and spending habits and concluded that you're showing early signs of diminished capacity. My blood ran cold. She diagnosed me without ever meeting me? Without any kind of examination? She reviewed the evidence we presented, the impulsive financial decisions, the social isolation, the resistance to family input on important matters. That's sufficient for a preliminary assessment. That's not a diagnosis, Sarah. That's character assassination. And you know it. There was a pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice had changed. Less professional, more vulnerable. Mom, do you have any idea how scared we've been? You've been so different lately, so distant. And then this trip. $30,000 to go halfway around the world by yourself at your age? That's not the careful, responsible mother who raised us. And there it was, the heart of their betrayal. They weren't scared of my mental decline. They were scared of my transformation. They were terrified that the mother who'd always put their needs first was finally learning to put herself first. The woman who'd sacrificed her own dreams for their security was finally claiming some dreams of her own. Sarah, I'm not different. I'm just finally free. For the first time since your father died, I don't have to consider anyone else's needs before I make a decision about my own life. That's not mental illness, that's mental health. But what if something happens to you in Scotland? What if you get sick, or lost, or confused? What if you run out of money and need help? We'd be on the other side of an ocean, unable to protect you. Protect me. The same word Emma had used. But coming from Sarah, it carried different weight. Sarah had always been my cautious child, the one who worried about everything, who planned for disasters that might never happen. Her divorce had made those tendencies worse, turning her into someone who saw threat around every corner. Sarah, people travel alone all the time. Women my age take trips to foreign countries every day without requiring their children's permission or supervision. I'm not a child. I'm not incompetent. I'm a grown woman who earned the right to make her own choices. But the money, Mom, that's what we're really worried about. You worked so hard to build financial security, and now you're spending it like there's no tomorrow. What if you live to 90? What if you need expensive medical care? What if I die tomorrow and never got to see the places your father dreamed about? I interrupted. What if I spend my last healthy years worrying about theoretical disasters instead of living the life I want? Sarah, you can't protect yourself from every possible future. Sometimes you have to take risks to make life worth living. That's easy to say when you're not the ones who'll have to take care of you if everything goes wrong. The words hung in the air between us, brutal in their honesty. This wasn't about protecting me. It was about protecting themselves from the burden I might become. They were so afraid of having to support me in my old age that they'd decided to take control of my assets now, while they could still manage the situation on their terms. Sarah, I said quietly, is that what this is really about? You're worried that I might spend my own money instead of saving it to make your lives easier? That's not... I didn't mean... She stammered, caught off guard by her own honesty. Because if that's the case, let me make something very clear. I will never be a burden to you or Emma. I've spent my entire adult life making sure I could take care of myself. But I will also not spend my remaining years living like a pauper, just to preserve an inheritance you haven't earned. We're not talking about inheritance, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. We're talking about making sure you have enough money for your own needs. My own needs include living the life I want, not the life you think I should want. My own needs include honoring the promises I made to your father. My own needs include finally putting my dreams on the same priority level as everyone else's emergencies. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but we were talking past each other. Sarah saw a reckless old woman who needed to be saved from her own poor judgment. I saw a daughter so consumed with worry about the future that she'd forgotten how to value the present. After I hung up, I finished packing in a haze of grief and rage. My Scottish adventure was over before it had truly begun, killed by the two people I'd loved most in the world. The month I'd planned as a celebration of freedom had become a desperate race home to save what remained of my independence. As my taxi wound through Edinburgh's ancient streets toward the airport, I caught glimpses of the Scotland Patrick and I had dreamed of exploring together. Cobblestone closes leading to hidden gardens, medieval spires reaching toward cloudy skies, locals going about their daily business in a city that had been continuously inhabited for over 1,000 years. I should have been starting my first full day in this magical place. Instead, I was fleeing back to Boston to fight a war I'd never seen coming, against enemies I'd raised from birth to be better than this. The airport was bustling with travelers heading to dozens of destinations: London, Paris, Amsterdam, New York. All around me, people were beginning adventures, visiting family, conducting business, living their lives with the assumption that they had the right to make their own choices about where to go and how to spend their time and money. I envied them their certainty, their freedom, their trust that the people they loved wouldn't betray them in the name of protection. As I boarded the plane that would carry me back across the Atlantic, I thought about Margaret's words from our last conversation: document everything you can. She was right. This wasn't just a family disagreement anymore. It was a legal battle, and I needed to start thinking like the businesswoman I'd been rather than the heartbroken mother I'd become. Emma and Sarah had made a crucial tactical error. They'd underestimated their mother. 42 years in Boston real estate hadn't just taught me about property values. It had taught me about human nature, leverage, and the art of strategic warfare. They thought they were protecting a confused old woman from her own poor judgment. They were about to discover they'd declared war on a fighter. But as the plane lifted off from Edinburgh Airport, carrying me away from the Scotland I'd barely had time to glimpse, I couldn't stop the tears that had been building since Margaret's phone call. I was flying home to save my life, but part of me would always remain in that hotel room overlooking Edinburgh Castle, mourning the mother I'd been before I learned what my children really thought of me. The Scotland adventure was over. The real fight was just beginning. The plane touched down at Logan Airport at 10:47 p.m. Boston time, exactly 26 hours after I'd left Edinburgh in what felt like another lifetime. As we taxied to the gate, I stared out at the familiar skyline of my city and felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest where maternal warmth used to live. During the 8-hour flight from London, I'd used every minute of airplane Wi-Fi to research, plan, and prepare. I'd contacted my bank, my investment advisor, my insurance company, and most importantly, my old friend Detective Ray Morrison, Patricia's husband and a 30-year veteran of the Boston Police Department's Fraud Division. If Emma and Sarah wanted to play legal games, they were about to discover that their mother had been playing those games professionally for 4 decades. The other passengers filed off the plane with the weary shuffle of international travelers, but I moved with purpose. My small carry-on bag contained everything I needed for what was coming: printed copies of every financial document that proved my competency, contact information for witnesses who could attest to my mental state, and a recording app on my phone that had already captured my conversations with both daughters. Margaret was waiting for me at baggage claim, her usually immaculate silver hair disheveled and her face drawn with exhaustion. When she saw me, she rushed over with the kind of fierce hug that only comes from someone who's been holding your life together while you were gone. "Catherine, thank God you're back," she said, pulling away to examine my face. "How are you holding up?" "I'm better than I was 12 hours ago," I said. And it was true. The shock and grief had crystallized into something harder and more useful: resolve. "What's the current situation?" Margaret's expression darkened. "They finished clearing out the main floor this afternoon. The moving trucks left around 4 p.m., but there are still cars in your driveway. Emma and Sarah are both there, along with Tyler and Madison. I think they're planning to spend the night." Of course they were. They'd claimed my house was too dangerous for me to live in alone, but apparently it was safe enough for them and their children to occupy. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but no longer surprising. "Did you get the photos I asked for?" I said as we walked toward the exit. Margaret handed me her phone and I scrolled through dozens of images that documented the systematic destruction of my life. My antique dining room set, the one Patrick and I had bought at an estate sale in Newport during our 5th year of marriage, being loaded onto a truck. My mother's china cabinet, empty and ghostly. The Persian rug from my living room rolled up like a discarded newspaper. But the photo that stopped me cold was of my bedroom. They'd taken Patrick's side of the bed, his nightstand, his lamp, the small wooden box where he'd kept his cufflinks and his father's watch. They'd dismantled our shared space, erasing the physical evidence of our 22 years together, as if our marriage had been nothing more than a real estate arrangement. "I'm going to destroy them," I said quietly, and Margaret didn't flinch at the coldness in my voice. "I've been documenting everything," she said as we climbed into her car. "Times, dates, which items went where. I also talked to some of the moving crew when Emma and Sarah weren't looking. Apparently, they were told this was a standard estate liquidation for an elderly woman who'd been placed in assisted living. So they lied to the movers, too. I wasn't surprised, but each new detail of their deception added fuel to the fire building in my chest. What about the house sale? It went live on the MLS this morning. The listing agent is someone named Jennifer Walsh. I think she works with Sarah's ex-husband's firm. They've got it priced at $2, $8 million. I almost laughed. My house was worth at least $3, $5 million in the current market, possibly more given the recent renovations I'd completed. They were so eager to liquidate my assets that they were literally throwing money away. Margaret, I need you to do something for me, I said as we drove through the late-night Boston streets. I need you to call Jennifer Walsh first thing tomorrow morning and tell her you're interested in viewing the property. Don't mention that you know me. Just say you're a serious buyer looking in Beacon Hill. What are you planning, Catherine? I'm planning to give my daughters exactly what they've asked for, a demonstration of what happens when you underestimate Catherine Hayes. We drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Margaret had known me long enough to recognize when I'd shifted from emotional reaction to strategic planning. During my years building my real estate business, she'd watched me navigate hostile negotiations, manipulative clients, and predatory competitors. She knew that the woman sitting beside her wasn't a confused elderly victim. She was a professional who'd been personally attacked and was preparing to respond accordingly. As we turned onto my street, I could see lights blazing in my Victorian townhouse. 2 cars were parked in my driveway, Emma's Honda Civic and Sarah's leased BMW. Through the front windows, I caught glimpses of movement. My daughters were in there, probably congratulating themselves on how efficiently they'd handled their mother's crisis. "Drop me at the corner," I told Margaret. "I want to observe before they know I'm here." I stood on the sidewalk outside Mrs. Chen's house, the elderly woman who'd lived across the street for 30 years, and studied my own home like a crime scene, which, legally speaking, it was. Through the front bay window, I could see Emma in what used to be my living room, now stripped bare except for a few pieces of furniture they'd deemed too worthless to sell. She was sitting on the floor with Tyler, playing some kind of card game. The scene would have been heartwarming if not for the fact that she was playing in the ruins of my demolished life. Sarah was in the kitchen, visible through the side window, talking on her phone while Madison did homework at my breakfast bar. The normalcy of it was obscene. My daughters treating my home like a vacation rental they'd rented for the weekend, their children treating it like a playground. I walked up my front steps, the same steps Patrick and I had climbed as newlyweds 42 years ago. The same steps where Emma and Sarah had posed for prom photos and graduation pictures. My key still worked, which was almost insulting. They'd stolen my life but hadn't even bothered to change the locks. The front door opened into what had once been my elegant foyer, now echoing and empty except for a few boxes stacked against the wall. The Persian runner I'd bought in Morocco during a rare vacation was gone. The antique hall tree Patrick had restored was gone. The mirror where I'd checked my appearance every morning for 42 years was gone. "Emma!" I called out, my voice carrying through the stripped house. The sound of the card game stopped abruptly. I heard whispered conversation, then footsteps. Emma appeared in the doorway between the foyer and living room, her face cycling through surprise, guilt, and defensive anger in the space of 3 seconds. "Mom," she said, trying to force brightness into her voice. "You're back early. How was Scotland?" I looked past her to Tyler, my 8-year-old grandson, who was staring at me with wide, confused eyes from his spot on the bare hardwood floor. Whatever Emma and Sarah had told the children about their grandmother's sudden illness, Tyler clearly didn't understand why his Nana's house looked like a crime scene. "Scotland was beautiful," I said calmly, though I didn't get to see much of it, thanks to the family emergency that called me home. Sarah emerged from the kitchen with Madison trailing behind her. My younger daughter had the grace to look genuinely uncomfortable, her lawyer's training probably telling her that this confrontation wasn't going to go the way they'd planned. "Mom, we need to talk," Sarah said, glancing meaningfully at the children. "Maybe we should." "No," I said, my voice cutting through her diplomatic attempts. "We're not going to handle this privately anymore. You made this a public matter when you brought trucks to my house and told the neighbors I was mentally incompetent. We'll discuss it publicly." I walked into what had been my living room and looked around at the empty space where my life used to be. The built-in bookcases Patrick had installed were naked. My collection of first edition mysteries and travel guides vanished. The corner where my baby grand piano had stood for 20 years was marked only by indentations in the hardwood. "Where's my piano?" I asked. Emma and Sarah exchanged glances. "We sold it to a family in Newton," Emma said finally. "Tyler, why don't you and Madison go upstairs and watch TV in Grandma's bedroom?" "Actually," I said, stopping the children before they could leave, "I'd like Tyler and Madison to stay. I think they should understand what their mothers have been doing." "Catherine," Sarah said, using my first name instead of Mom for the first time I could remember. This isn't appropriate for the children. What's not appropriate is teaching them that it's acceptable to steal from family members and then pretend it's for their own good, I replied. But you're right. Let me handle the children first. I knelt down to Tyler's eye level. He was a beautiful boy, all Emma's delicate features mixed with his absent father's dark coloring. He'd always been my shadow during family gatherings, the grandchild who wanted to help in the kitchen and hear stories about his grandfather Patrick. Tyler, I said gently, do you remember when you broke my lamp last Christmas and tried to hide it behind the couch? He nodded solemnly. And what did I tell you about mistakes and honesty? You said it's better to tell the truth and face the consequences than to lie and make things worse, he recited. That's right. Now your mom and Aunt Sarah made a very big mistake with Grandma's house and Grandma's things. They thought they were helping, but they weren't honest with me about what they were planning. Do you understand? Tyler looked between his mother and me, confusion written across his 8-year-old face. Are you sick, Grandma? Mom said you might be getting sick and we needed to help take care of you. I felt something crack inside my chest. They'd used my grandbaby as part of their justification, told him his beloved grandmother was failing and needed their protection. The manipulation was even more extensive than I'd realized. Tyler, I'm not sick, I said clearly. I went to Scotland because I wanted to see the places your grandfather used to tell me about. Your mom and Aunt Sarah were worried about me spending money on the trip, but I'm perfectly healthy and I made the decision to go because it was important to me. But why is all your stuff gone? Out of the mouths of babes. I glanced at Emma, whose face had gone pale. That's what I'm here to find out, I said, standing up and turning my attention to my daughters. Tyler, Madison, I need you to go upstairs now. The grown-ups need to have a difficult conversation. After the children disappeared up the staircase, I turned to face Emma and Sarah. They were standing together in the empty living room like defendants waiting for a verdict, which wasn't far from the truth. Before we begin, I said, pulling out my phone, I want you to know that I'm recording this conversation. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, so you don't get to object. Sarah's lawyer training kicked in immediately. Mom, I don't care what you think I should do, I interrupted. That's the entire problem. You've both decided that your opinions about my life matter more than my own opinions about my life. I walked to the center of the room, to the spot where my favorite armchair used to sit. For 40 years, I'd curled up in that chair to read, to think, to plan my days, and review my real estate contracts. Emma had sold it to someone in Brookline for $200, according to Margaret's documentation. Let's start with the basics, I said. I want you to explain to me, in your own words, why you thought you had the right to liquidate my possessions while I was in another country. Emma spoke first, her voice defensive but trying for reasonable. Mom, we were scared. You've been acting differently for months, more isolated, more defensive about money, making impulsive decisions. The Scotland trip was the final straw. $30,000 for a vacation when you should be conserving assets for your future care. Impulsive, I repeated. I planned that trip for 2 years, Emma. I researched itineraries, saved money specifically for it, and booked everything months in advance. How is that impulsive? But the amount? Sarah interjected. Mom, that's more than most people make in 6 months. It shows a disconnect from financial reality. I almost laughed. Sarah, I sold my real estate business for $3 million. I have another $8 million in investments and retirement accounts. My annual income from those investments is approximately $280,000. Spending $30,000 on a once-in-a-lifetime trip represents roughly 4% of my annual income. Most financial advisors recommend spending 4 to 5% of your assets annually in retirement. My Scotland trip was actually conservative spending. The silence that followed was telling. They'd convinced themselves I was being financially reckless because they'd never bothered to understand my actual financial situation. They'd seen the dollar amount of the trip without considering it in the context of my overall wealth. But what if you need long-term care? Emma said, falling back on their standard argument. What if you live to 90 and need nursing home care for 10 years? That could cost millions. Then I'll pay for it with my own money, I said simply. Emma, I've spent 42 years making sure I'd never be a financial burden on anyone. I have long-term care insurance. I have more than enough assets to pay for any care I might need, but I also have the right to enjoy some of that money while I'm healthy enough to travel. I walked to the empty bay window where my antique writing desk used to sit. That desk had belonged to my grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd used it to manage their households and write their letters. Emma had sold it to an antique dealer on Charles Street for $400. But let's talk about the real issue, I continued. This isn't about my spending. This is about control. You've both been struggling financially, and instead of asking me directly for help, you decided to take control of my assets so you could manage them according to your priorities instead of mine. That's not true, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Sarah, you need money for Madison's private school and to fight your ex-husband in court. Emma, Tyler's medical bills from his asthma treatments aren't fully covered by your insurance. You're both looking at my wealth and seeing the solution to your problems. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos Margaret had sent me. You sold my piano for $8,000. It was worth $15,000 minimum. You sold my dining room set for $1,200, a set that would retail for at least $4,000. You've been so eager to convert my possessions into cash that you're literally throwing money away. Emma's face crumpled. We weren't trying to steal from you. We were trying to create a more manageable financial situation. All that furniture, all those possessions, they were just things collecting dust. They were my things, I said, my voice rising for the first time. That piano was where I played lullabies for you when you were babies. That dining room set was where we had Sunday dinners for 20 years. Those weren't random possessions collecting dust. They were my life, my memories, my choices about how I wanted to live in my own home. Sarah was crying now, which might have moved me yesterday. Today, it just felt manipulative. Mom, we're sorry, she said. We thought we were protecting you. From what? From living the life I want instead of the life you think I should want. From spending my own money on my own dreams. From finally putting my needs somewhere other than dead last on the priority list. I walked to the mantelpiece where our family photos used to be displayed. They'd packed those too, probably planning to redistribute them according to their own preferences. Here's what's going to happen, I said, turning back to face them. Tomorrow morning, you're both going to contact everyone who purchased my belongings and offer to buy them back at 50% above what they paid. You're going to use your own money. The money you were so worried about me wasting. Mom, we can't afford that, Emma protested. Then you'll figure it out. Get loans, sell your own possessions, ask your ex-husbands for help. I don't care how you solve the problem, but you created this situation, and you're going to fix it. Sarah's lawyer instincts kicked in. What if they won't sell back? What if some of the items are already gone? Then you'll replace them with comparable items of equal or greater value. And Sarah, since you're so concerned about legal procedures, let me tell you what I learned during my flight home. I pulled out the printed documents I'd prepared. The power of attorney you obtained was based on a psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Rebecca Chen, who never examined me and who based her assessment entirely on information you provided. That's called fraud. The court order you obtained was based on false medical evidence, which makes it invalid, and selling my possessions without valid legal authority is theft, regardless of your stated intentions. The color drained from both their faces. I've already contacted Detective Morrison in the fraud division, I continued. He's very interested in cases where adult children manipulate legal systems to steal from their parents. Apparently, it's becoming quite common. You're going to have us arrested? Emma whispered. That depends entirely on how quickly and completely you fix what you've broken, I said. I want every single item returned or replaced within 30 days. I want my house removed from the market immediately. I want my bank accounts and investments restored to my control. And I want both of you to attend family therapy sessions with me so we can figure out how to rebuild some semblance of trust. I walked to the window and looked out at Beacon Hill, at the neighborhood where I'd lived and worked and raised my family for 4 decades. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of rebuilding my life. Tonight, I just wanted to sleep in my own house, even if it was currently empty of everything that had made it home. There's one more thing, I said without turning around. I'm rescheduling my Scotland trip. I'm going back next month and I'm staying for 6 weeks instead of 4. Consider it a penalty fee for forcing me to cut my original vacation short. Mom, Sarah said tentatively, what if we'd handled this differently? What if we'd come to you directly with our concerns? I turned to look at her, this daughter I'd raised to be strong and ethical and independent. Then we would have had a conversation. I might have explained my financial situation more clearly. I might have helped you with your immediate problems without you having to resort to theft. We might have found a way to address your concerns without destroying 42 years of trust. Is that still possible? Emma asked. Can we fix this? I looked at both my daughters. these women I'd sacrificed everything for, who decided my sacrifice meant I was weak rather than strong. The betrayal still burned, but underneath the anger, I could feel something else stirring. Not forgiveness exactly, but the faint possibility of it. I don't know, I said honestly. That depends on whether you're capable of seeing me as your mother instead of as a problem to be managed. It depends on whether you can respect my right to make my own choices, even when you disagree with them. And it depends on whether you can rebuild the trust you destroyed. Emma was crying openly now. We never meant for it to go this far. We were scared of losing you. So you decided to control me instead of love me, I said. Emma, fear doesn't justify what you've done. Love doesn't justify what you've done. Nothing justifies taking away someone's autonomy and dignity in the name of protection. I walked toward the staircase, exhausted by the confrontation and the long journey home. I'm sleeping in my own house tonight, in my own bedroom, what's left of it. Tomorrow we start fixing what you've broken, and next month, I'm going back to Scotland to finish what I started. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I could hear Emma and Sarah talking in low, urgent voices. They were probably strategizing, figuring out how to minimize the damage, calculating the cost of undoing their systematic destruction of my life. But for the first time in 26 hours, I felt something approaching peace. I was home. I was fighting back. And I was finally, definitively done being the mother who sacrificed everything for children who'd never learned to value the sacrifice. My bedroom was a hollow echo of what it had been, but the bed was still there. They'd apparently decided it wasn't worth selling. I lay down fully clothed on the bare mattress and stared at the ceiling Patrick and I had painted together during our 3rd year in the house. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and phone calls and the complicated process of reclaiming my life. But tonight, I was Catherine Hayes again. Not the confused elderly woman my daughters had invented, not the victim of their betrayal, but the fighter who'd built something from nothing and wasn't about to let anyone take it away. Scotland was waiting for me. Patrick's dreams were waiting for me. My own dreams were waiting for me. And for the first time in 42 years, I was ready to put those dreams first, regardless of who approved or disapproved, regardless of who understood or misunderstood, regardless of whether my own daughters ever learned to see me as something more than their safety net. I closed my eyes and let myself imagine the Highlands again, the ancient stones and endless skies that Robert had described. Next month, I would walk those hills for Patrick and for myself. I would finally complete the journey that my daughter's betrayal had interrupted. But first, I had a war to win, and Catherine Hayes had never lost a war that mattered. The mother they thought they knew had been destroyed in a hotel room in Edinburgh. The woman who'd come home to fight was someone they'd never met. Someone who'd finally learned that love without respect isn't love at all, and that protecting someone by controlling them isn't protection at all. They were about to get an education in exactly who their mother really was, beneath 42 years of maternal sacrifice. And I suspected they weren't going to like the lesson, but they were going to learn it anyway. When I was boarding a vacation flight, my phone rang. Quick, come back home. Your daughters are selling everything and will leave you with nothing. I started crying on the flight without being able to do anything. When I landed, I had an attitude that made them go crazy.